All right, g'day. Welcome back to Collectivitis, podcast where we dissect the disease that is collectivism. My name is Pietro. I've got a very special guest with me today, and I'll just briefly introduce him before I let him say anything, because I'm sure he won't actually love aspects of this introduction. This guest today is an absolute wealth of knowledge on campaigning of all sorts. He's worked in the industry for, I believe, over 20 years, working for primarily minor parties to do with elections and campaigning and trying to win elections. And for those of you who don't know, in 2021, late 2021, I lost my teaching job due to mandates, and I actually worked for a year with this guest as my boss. And he didn't like being called boss, so that's why I'm doing it into the introduction before he can say anything. But this is my former boss. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome to the show Mr. Rick Westgarth. How are you, Rick?
Yeah, very well. Thank you, Pietro. And yeah, I don't like being called the boss. I think we work together. And I think it might be a little bit of a misnomer to say I've worked in the industry, because I do generally campaign for minor parties. There's often not a lot of pay in there. Money is quite tight. So I've been involved in politics and worked around elections for quite a long time. But yeah, working might be a bit of a stretch. But
Fair few volunteer hours in there, as I can attest to as well. Look, I think the most interesting spot to start, as always, I think, is who you are, how you got into the ideas of libertarianism, because I think there's usually some lessons there for trying to attract more people into libertarianism. So I didn't mention before, obviously, Rick is the current federal campaign manager for the Libertarian Party. When we worked together, it was the Liberal Democrats, but it's the same party. So I guess kind of a two-pronged question. How did you get to libertarianism? And then how does someone get into, working on campaigns? How does that start? How does someone enter that world if anyone's interested?
yeah, look, two really good questions. And so thank you for that. Look, I probably was always a libertarian. I grew up in a very small country town out in Western Victoria. And I think often people from the country have slightly more libertarian points of view. They're kind of like, just let me get on with doing my life. They're not as reliant on government services and so forth. So they generally just want to, work on their farm or do whatever they want to do. They want to go shooting, they want to do whatever, and they just pretty much want to be left alone. So I probably, without understanding what it meant, I used to always call myself, even as a teenager, a civil libertarian, because I generally thought, leave me alone, don't spy on me, and I'm happy. And that was pretty much what I thought. Look, I joined the Navy at 17. I went off, and I came from a very non-political family. Voting was always like, oh, I've got to go vote. Oh God, it's all going to be the same. But of course, when I was exposed to a lot more external sort of, I suppose, influences, I started paying attention, and I very quickly disliked, the two major parties. Now, we don't have a two-party system in Australia. In fact, a lot of places around the world where they say it's a two-party system, it isn't genuinely a two-party system. And I actually thought that we got our best democracy when we had alternative points of view being expressed. And so I got very interested in small parties and understanding how small parties could bring that sort of democracy and the everyday person's point of view, because I definitely didn't see the major parties presenting that. They look like they'll just do and say whatever they want to do to get in power. When they get in power, they'll do the opposite. Or they'll do something completely different. And so I probably always understood that getting elected wasn't the only benefit of campaigns. Being able to express different points of view was quite important. So this probably leads into your second question, was how do you get involved in campaigning? And generally it's by being interested and almost by accident. So at some point I was like, I've got to do something about this. I want to, be part of the change. And I thought, well, the best way to do that is to actually help the minor party. And I looked around at the minor parties. And at that point, after looking at all of them, I went, well, the Australian Democrats are pretty good. They're a democratic party. All their policies are voted on by their members, probably to their detriment sometimes, that it's too democratic in there. and so I just joined the party and started getting involved and going along to meetings and so forth. Well, if you show a little bit of aptitude, you very quickly get given tasks in the minor party. And I was always interested in elections. I wouldn't say I don't care about policies. I definitely care about policies, but I don't want to get into the reeds about policies. I'm like, you work out how the policy works. I'll work out how to try to sell it. And there is a big difference between policy and selling a policy. So basically, I started getting involved with the Australian Democrats, and um, pretty much there wasn't a lot of people who seemed to understand the elections, and they'd been a fairly big party. They had lost a lot. They only had a couple of members. They had no one federally. Had a couple of members at state based by the time was becoming involved. So in Victoria, that I put my hand up to organise the 2010 federal election in Victoria, and then found myself on the federal campaign committee. At that point, I was already a state executive member and a federal executive member. So, like I say, you want to get involved, you just sort of turn up and you start getting given jobs.
They start giving you roles, yeah.
Yeah. So I think the main thing is if you're interested in elections from a minor party point of view, then just turn up. As a major party, I can pretty much say if you're in a major party and you want to get involved in campaigns, one or two campaigns, if you show some aptitude, you'll soon get given jobs. So
even in a major party, you think?
Yeah, in a major party, if you're being involved in the party, you certainly might not be a campaign manager or something like that. But there's so many campaigns. All their lower house seats have campaign teams and so forth. So if you're a member of a local branch, and the Liberal or the Labor candidates running there, and you want to help their campaign, you might not get a paid role, but you will get a role. And if you show aptitude, very quickly they'll find a place for you.
I think that's a theme that we probably want to touch on for a fair section of this, which is the big differences between the major parties and the minor parties, and kind of how the perception of how elections work from the outside is very different to how they work from the inside, especially in that regard there. I'll start with my first day when I started working with you, initially as a volunteer, and I came into the office, and I knew a fair amount about like the philosophy of politics and libertarianism, and generally how the parties manipulate voters and messaging and that sort of thing. But I realized that even I had been naive and kind of bright-eyed the first day I came in thinking that elections were more democratic and more honest and more just, and how the whole system worked actually somewhat reflected the way that the average Australia or the average voter feels, and that votes do have a say. And very quickly you dispelled a lot of those notions and showed me that actually it's much more crooked and it's much more messed up than I had ever thought. I remember that first day was just a really long civics lesson about how the major parties essentially wrought the system to maintain power, and even the minor parties, the things with preferences and deals and stuff. At the end of the day, it's all kind of a way of massaging votes to go in the direction that the actual power brokers want to manipulate these things. The voter gets a very small say, if a say at all. So there's
quite a bit of smokescreen about it.
Yeah, well, exactly. So that's kind of what I really wanted to unpack some of today. The first thing I think I wanted to talk about was compulsory voting. Now, compulsory voting is not necessarily a thing everywhere in the world. In fact, I dare say, are we a minority in terms of countries around the world that do it?
Absolutely. There's around about 13% of the nations around the world have compulsory voting. And in fact, of recent times, a lot of countries, sort of since the 1990s to very recently, have been dropping it. So there is, I actually have some figures there. I think it's 13% of the world's population is in areas where there is compulsory voting, which is around about 22 nations, and there's 172 nations that don't have compulsory voting. So, that's 85% of the world's population is not in countries that have compulsory voting. If anyone wants to do the maths, you'll go, oh, that's not 100%. That's because there's 2% of the world that doesn't have any voting.
Yeah. I was just thinking that. I was like, I wonder what the last 2% does. So we're very much a minority there, and we certainly cling to this compulsory voting thing. I know that, obviously the Libertarian Party, one of our policies is to remove compulsory voting. But generally, more broadly, I don't think there's much of a conversation around it. I don't think there's much of an appetite for it in the political realm. I'm sure lots of voters can't be asked going to the polls as often as they do and as often as they have. So why does Australia have compulsory voting, do you think? Why do we cling to this idea so fervently?
Well, and I think this is probably going to segue into one of the other topics you want to talk about. But look, Australia introduced compulsory voting, I think it was 1924. It was after Queensland had a state election, and they had compulsory voting, and their voter turnout went up significantly. Of course, the federal party went, oh, well, okay, this is the federal government was like, oh, this is great. We need more people to vote because it is going to basically the general, I suppose, idea of it is if a higher percentage of people vote, the government has more legitimacy. So, if you only have 30% of people turn out to vote, then people are like, oh, did they really win? So that's the general idea, but that's not the actual outcome that happens. So around the world, whether there is compulsory voting or not compulsory voting, voter turnout has been dropping basically for quite a few decades now. And pretty much at the same rate, whether it's compulsory voting or not compulsory voting. So what that generally in Australia, because we have election funding and the government parties get paid for every vote cast for them, compulsory voting in more modern era has been more linked to get as many people to go and vote. So there's also a large percentage of people who really don't care about politics, don't follow politics, and they vote traditionally. So the major parties know they're making people vote. There's pretty much a set balance that like the swing isn't going to be dramatic. When there's optional voting, that swing is undeterminable and can be quite large. And you look at things in the US politics and so forth. So I suppose it gives a more level playing field for the major parties as well as gives them money. So why we have it? There's some probably people could make good reasons of why we have it. I think there's more reasons why there's not looking at it. So a very interesting point is, like I mentioned, a lot of countries have been abandoning compulsory voting, where there's not that conversation in Australia. Like no one, apart from probably the Libertarian parties, is even discussing removing compulsory voting.
Lots of points I want to dig into there. You've kind of covered a whole host of areas. First of all, I wanted to double down and get you to explain a little bit election funding, because I think a lot of people don't realize this. I know that during the last two big elections, talking even just to friends of mine who aren't super into politics, they were horrified and shocked to find out that, for every vote that's cast, there's taxpayer money given to the party. So you're forced to vote, and then additionally, you're actually forced to pay for your vote as well to one of the parties who you're committing to. So can you explain the election funding a little bit, and also how that is in itself rigged to favor the major parties?
Yeah, look, this is you mentioned before about elections being scams, but ultimately, this is all legal. It's all
I'm not saying a scam in terms of the law. I'm saying it's written in a way that
well, this is the thing
unjust.
is that they actually write the law so it benefits them. So yeah, look, absolutely. What pretty much state and federal elections, there is election funding. Now what that means is when you go and vote, and you vote generally, there's some differences. Queensland doesn't have an upper house, but so federally, and most states, there's an upper and a lower house. So you got to vote on the small bit of paper for your local member, and you vote on the larger white paper for the upper house. When you cast your vote, so I'll just talk federally here. when you vote for the lower house, your local member, whoever you give your first vote to, they're potentially eligible for $3.29 receiving for that vote, which they will get after the election. But then, of course, when you vote for the upper house and you put your one particular, and most people will vote above the line for a party, that party will receive $3.29 again. So there's around about, bit over $6.50. So I always give the example that you're being forced to vote. And then the people you go and vote for, which predominantly are the major parties in this country, they're going to get money for it. So it's kind of like saying you have to vote. But when you walk in the door and we tick you off, give us $10. Now, I know $6.50 is not $10, but you got to look at the administration of, getting the tax, paying it back and all that.
Yeah.
So it's costing you probably $10. So you're being made to go and do something you generally don't want to do, and you're being made to pay $10 for it. Now, it gets even worse because if you don't vote, you're potentially up for a fine. Now, federally, that's you'll get a letter. The letter will say you didn't vote. Unfortunately, this is where it's even more of a scam because it's a $20 fee. So they kind of say, look, if you pay the $20, you won't, that's it, we'll end it. But it actually is criminal. They've actually made it, it's a law, you must vote. So I did just want to read this from a government document. So this is the letter, part of the letter you get. So if you pay the $20 administration penalty by the due date, the matter will be referred, if you do not, the matter will be referred to a court. So as previously advised, failure to vote is a criminal offence without a valid or sufficient reason under section government chat. If you are found guilty of this offence, a court may impose a maximum fine of $222, plus a criminal conviction may be recorded against you. So I don't know, but this is probably the only law they say you can break the law, but if you give us this little fee, everything's good. So it's like, look, we believe you stolen the car, but if you pay us $100 administration fee, that's okay. Like this is absolutely a scam. It's designed to frighten people to make sure they vote. And then, of course, we know when you go and vote, you're going to be giving one of the parties some money.
It's such a perverse idea for someone who comes from our camp, our point of view, that, the government is either completely illegitimate or the vast majority of what they do is illegitimate. And even by voting for anyone, let's say, being involved in whatever way with the democratic process, you are somehow supporting or somehow committing to it some level of interest or some level of yourself. And that in and of itself is illegal. You have to be involved in this thing that you vehemently disagree with on every facet. It's just completely statist in its overall worldview. It's completely against everything. It's the most statist thing.
Just to add something to there though, because the viewers might be sort of thinking, oh, well, that's okay. Everyone gets money for it. It's like, no. There's another little provision in the rules there that you've got to get 4% of the primary vote. So you've got to get 4% of people give you a 1 in your box before you get that. Now, you think, well, 4% is an arbitrary number. Why 4%? Well, because very few people that aren't a major party get 4% of the vote. So effectively what they're saying is we want the money, but we don't want to let anyone else get the money. So, and we'll probably go into it, but there's a whole lot of ways that just sort of keeps the roof on smaller parties getting bigger.
Yeah, I did want to get into that as well. A couple of things still on the original point that you made. There's a couple of points which I thought were really interesting. This idea of perceived legitimacy, and you're right, because I mean, if everyone is forced into this system, then that whole lie of, hey, this democracy, we all chose together, we were all involved in this decision, you cast your vote, hey, you had a part in this, you are complicit in.
It's kind of like you can't complain about the government after an election if you were all made to vote.
Yeah, so that, I mean, as backwards and as following this logic is, it is a great talking point, and it is something that's parroted to us especially by the people in power. And something else that you mentioned, which I thought was interesting, was the idea that because voting is compulsory and because there's people who get caught in these ruts of, who they vote for, and there's all this noise around election because everyone's vote is up for grabs, it is impossible for, or very nearly impossible for, like an inspirational revolutionary candidate to rise up with their own following and with inspirational new different ideas. And because if voting wasn't compulsory and say only 30% of the population was voting, that means that there's, this widely, sort of asleep, unawakened portion of society that's waiting for someone to be inspirational enough to take their vote. Whereas if you're voting every time, regardless of anything, you kind of end up being set in your ways, and there's less possibility of this, inspirational, revolutionary, say, libertarian, Javier Milei-esque candidate rising up.
True, and look, probably a couple of points. Interesting point. Argentina is a country that has compulsory voting. So
is it really? There you go. So
yeah.
Javier Milei did it even against that.
He did it against that, yeah. So again, gives a lot of credence to maybe the discontent in Argentina around the status quo at the moment. But look, I think that's a very valid point that you make. And what you generally get, and this is my opinion, but I suppose to start off with, a lot of people think, oh, if you've got optional voting, that means that hardly anyone's going to turn out. And I think probably if we did it in Australia, maybe the first election, you'd get a very low. But around the world where there is optional voting, around about 60% of people still go and vote. It's not micro. But you're 100% right that inspiration are coming up, because what compulsory voting generally, I believe, leads to is, instead of the parties trying to win your vote, they just want to make you not vote for the other big party. So, there's no one in the major parties that are going, well, I'm going to have a vision for Australia. I want to go out and tell people what I want to achieve. I want to, how I'm going to make the country better, how I'm going to make people's lives better. They generally are talking about what the other party is going to do, so don't vote for them. And it leads to a negative campaign. And even when they're not being negative, the other party, they're not being inspirational. They're not giving us a vision. So there is no what can we do? What can we do differently? It is a status quo. Every election, people talk about, oh, this party is going to give us this much rebate, or this party is going to fund school lunches. There's no, oh, I want to build our economy. I want to, make us the leaders in space technology or anything like that. There's no big vision. Where if you've got optional voting, and there's someone like a libertarian saying, look, I'm going to make sure, that we're a wealthy country, and that our trading partners respect us, and that the worker will have a good pay, regardless of who you're working for. The money you take home is going to be yours. We want to build infrastructure through partnerships and all that sort of stuff. You don't get that. You get, oh, the other party wants to take Medicare away from you, or something like that. And I think it forces the average voter into just, oh, I normally vote. So unless you really hate the party you normally vote for, you're just going to keep doing it. And I don't think that gives us democracy. And to the point, those minor parties don't get much of a say. So what you get is, you don't get an election of ideas. You don't get, even if a libertarian Javier Milei kind of person came up in Australia, even though they didn't get elected, it will be putting this into the sphere of public perception. And if that person got a high vote, even not elected, the other parties go, oh, we better pay attention. But I think we have some great ideas in the Libertarian Party, but I think there's some of the other small parties have some good ideas too. But while they're always being pushed down because of the voting system and the funding and all that, there's no pressure. The elections aren't putting pressure on the major parties. There's no one there going, well, I came out of nowhere and got 12% of the vote. The other parties have to go, oh, well, a lot of people agree with that person. Maybe we should look at it. We don't get that. We just get status quo every election.
Yeah, and I think so much of it keeps coming back to this idea of the major party status quo harms a lot of the way our voting system is even theoretically supposed to work. And there's so many facets to this. Like, even if we go back to the election funding, right? 4% of the vote would get you election funding, which essentially means and correct me if I'm wrong here, but the major parties will automatically have their campaigns paid for or almost entirely paid for by voters every election cycle. So all the campaign ads and all of that stuff you see, they know they're going to get that portion of the vote back, so they can plaster their ads everywhere at no cost to themselves and at no risk. Whereas a minor party has to scrounge and rely on donations and rely on, probably their volunteer base, which is likely overworked because they're a minor party and all of that, just to hit this benchmark of 4%. And 4% is an incredibly high benchmark when you have to take that off, the rusted on voters from other parties. And it essentially means that, a minor party needs to have the stamina to rely on off its own back for a decade, 2 decades now, the Libertarian Party, until they can build that base of 4%, because there's no support, there's no help in getting up to that. Now, as libertarians, obviously, we don't necessarily agree that there needs to be that support to get up to that 4%. But when you're competing with major parties that are getting that support, it 10-fold, 20-fold, 30-fold, it's impossible. It's an impossible task, or almost.
Yeah, look, I think, and there's a couple of very good points in that. As libertarians, I want to get rid of compulsory voting. Also, I want to get rid of election funding, and in the short term,
level the playing field. Yeah,
that might harm us. Now, but if you're going to have it, make it for every vote, regardless of what percentage. Make it fair. Like fairness has to be important. It's important. Well, a lot of the argument of having election funding was that if parties were funded by taxpayer by the government, they wouldn't be reliant on donors, right? So that the whole idea when they wanted to bring it in was, if they're not relying on donors, they won't be beholden to them. But what happens is now the major parties get these major donations from all, banks and all sorts of stuff, and they still get the election funding as well. Yeah. So no, you're probably wrong. The election funding won't completely fund them, but what it does, it is a guaranteed amount of money, to the point that the major parties can go to a bank before an election and take out a loan so that they can spend that money, because they know they're going to get it. They always get around about $25 to $29 million per major party, and for a federal election. So they take a short-term loan out of the bank, spend all the money, because you get it back afterwards. Now, there was a law change. You used to be able to get back more than you spent, right? But of course, major parties never did that. This is one of the things they got Pauline Hanson for and sent her to jail, because if you had a big following, you could actually run a campaign and spend $10,000 and get $100,000 back and profit from it. And they sort of went after her for profiteering, but it was within the law, which is why it all eventually got dropped anyway, after she went to jail for a while, which was then putting pressure on what they seen as an opponent at the time. So they changed the law and went, okay, well, now you can only get back what you spend, but of course the major parties spend way more than they get, so they're always going to get everything back. So to your point, a minor party, you're scrounging for raise funds before an election, and let's say you can come up with $100,000 for a campaign, say something like in Victoria for a federal election. You're spending that money with no idea that you're going to get any of it back. You might not get 1 cent back of that, so you can't future plan anything.
Yeah.
But the major parties can get donors, and something like a by-election, and go, oh, that's okay, great. Well, they can get $30,000, $50,000 for a by-election, spend it, know they're going to get that back. So when they get it back, okay, they don't get back more than they spent, but they've basically built their war chest because they've got donor money. Now, a minor party is very difficult to build a war chest from doing that. Now, the other, I suppose, scenario is you've got something like Mr. Clive Palmer, who will go and put $100 million in, and I think he got something like $30,000 back. So is it really stopping people relying on big donors? Because a minor party is susceptible to a big donor coming in going, if you do what I say, I'll give you all this money. So it has a reverse effect as well.
Yeah, it's like this intended effect of removing the big donors in actual fact just adds the big donor on top of this for the majors. For the minors, it makes it completely reliant on the big donor if you want to do anything. It makes it very difficult for a principled party where everyone's already very economically wary to try and raise and to try and do these sorts of things. another point which I think is I'd like to hear your thoughts about. The 4% minimum to try and get the donation funding, the election funding. Most people don't really know about this at all, and in fact, there's a huge portion, I would say, of voters who vote for Liberal and Labor, who are very Liberal and Labor, especially, not so much the Greens, who are especially unhappy with the way that their own party goes, their own party works, their own party has been performing. But it's, this lesser of two evils, duopoly kind of mentality, whereas like, well, I have to vote for Liberal because I don't want Labor to win. I have to vote for Labor because I don't want Liberal to win. And we know in actual fact that our own, system here in Australia is designed especially to avoid this, where you can vote, number one for a minor party that you prefer. And if that minor party doesn't win, as it's incredibly unlikely that they will, your vote will eventually go to the major party that you prefer over the other one. So you can actually vote on principle and still avoid, the lesser of two evils if it actually does come to that. And on top of this, voting on principle would help the minor party that you actually like or that you actually prefer to get some election funding and to potentially grow in the future. And yet there seems to be this deliberate intention to keep this information kind of hidden away or not particularly in the public sphere, because it suits the major parties, because on top of getting the vote naturally, it crushes the chance of an opposition and it gives them the election funding that they wouldn't otherwise get for a number 2 or a number 3 vote. Do you think that's accurate? What do you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it feeds back into something I said before, which is you're 100% right. And I've said it to a lot of people, but again, to try to get the average voter to understand this, when there was there's over a few elections, there's been a few campaigns of, send a message, give an invalid vote. Well, that doesn't send a message. An invalid vote does nothing, right? So what you actually, if you want to send a message to the majors, you vote for a minor party first, because in Australia we have basically preferential voting, which is if the person you vote at number 1 doesn't get elected, well, then your vote goes to who your number 2 vote is. So, it'd be great if everyone sort of understood this, that if you voted for, and let's say, I'll say, pick a party, Libertarian Party, all right. If you voted for the Libertarian Party at number 1, if they didn't get elected and you put the party you want to win out of Labor or Liberal, at number 2, well, then your vote goes to them. But one, they don't get the vote, so which is a point you've made. So if we get 4%, that's great. We get some election funding. And of course, it takes election funding away from that major party. But what it also does do, if the Libertarian Party suddenly got 8% of the vote, that's when the major party that their number 2 goes to, because the parties will look at where their preferences go, oh, our supporters really like this Libertarian Party. We better listen to what their policies are. So if there was suddenly this huge protest vote to the minor parties, the major parties have to start saying, well, what is it they're saying that people like? What are their ideas that maybe we need to pay some attention to? So election funding is great to take away from the major parties, but I think that ability to send a message. Now, of course, the major parties and the media will say, oh, if you vote for a minor party, you're wasting your vote because they've got no chance of getting elected, which is the most stupidest thing, because your vote will go all the way down to if there's 8 candidates, your vote effectively goes all the way down. We end up with what we call a 2-party preferred. But effectively, your vote still goes to the last person who's elected. It's like just 7th gets eliminated. So your vote isn't with the 8th. So your vote goes all the way to the bottom. So there is no ever wasting a vote. You just put the party that you want to form government above the major party you don't want to form government.
Yeah, and so it's absurd when you think about this idea that it's a kind of it's a very, I actually think it's a great system, preferential voting. It's far superior to what they have in America, because it allows something like a minor party to not need to sabotage the major party that they prefer over the other one, the absolute evil versus the not quite so evil, whatever that may be in your mind. It allows you to not sabotage that and still grow over time and gain notoriety. Whereas, for example, the Libertarian Party in the US, very much, if they get 5%, if they get 10%, and say the vast majority of those libertarians do prefer the Republican candidate, they have probably sabotaged the Republican candidate's chance to win, which we don't need to do here.
That argument of wasting your vote is valid in the American system. If you do vote for a party that can't win, then you have wasted your vote because your vote goes nowhere afterwards. So a point I thought I should make actually on that compulsory voting and the election funding is most countries in the world that also have compulsory voting, there's a lot that don't enforce it. They say they've got compulsory voting, it's in their legislation, but they never enforce it. But nearly all of them stop that at age 70 or 75. Okay. So, because my mum is someone who's like, oh, why do I have to vote? She's 85 years old. She's on a walker, has to try to get into the nursing home. Well, in Australia, we make people vote up to the day they die. Right? We actually chase them in nursing homes. We have mobile voting stations go around to nursing homes and get them to vote. Now, why do we bother doing that? Because there's election funding.
Yeah.
So we want to make sure everyone votes to the last minute because the major parties want to make sure they get vote. Now, you can make arguments. That doesn't mean people over 70 can't vote. It's just that if they don't want to anymore, they're like, oh, look, what's it going to matter to me? They don't have to. But no, we'll still fine you $20 or give you a criminal conviction if you don't vote because goddamn we want that $3.29 twice.
It's just insane. I hadn't actually thought of that, but you're right. They go and harass elderly people and sometimes sick people in nursing homes because it's a financial gain for them through taxpayer funded. It's worthwhile monetarily. It's just insane. And the point I was going to make, if we're going to have this system such as preferential voting that we like, that we think is good and we think it works and has a way that you can make it work for you, and yet at the same time we keep people so in the dark about it. It's not like it's an important thing that is taught repeatedly and constantly repeated around election times. It's very much obfuscated around election times. As you said, the media says you're wasting your vote if you don't vote number one for one of the majors. And then on top of this obfuscation and on top of this trying to keep the population as ignorant as we can about how the voting system actually works, we add compulsory voting to it. So we know that the majority of people who are voting don't know that this is the way that the system works. Whereas if there were optional voting and say there was a 60%, 50%, 40% voter turnout, you'd imagine most of these are pretty well-informed voters. Like you're adding all the uninformed voters by throwing in compulsory voting on top of this thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that the outcome, like I mentioned earlier, is it will actually force parties, like where there is optional voting, a lot of effort goes into what the get out to vote. Making sure you're going out, making sure people are registered, encouraging you've got to vote in this election because it's important for. So not all of that is about having good policies, but and a little bit to your point before about even if it was from a major party, but that candidate that can come out and really grab the public with an idea, who can say, look, this is what I want to do. They don't have to put a lot of effort into the get out to vote. What happens is that they're already, just because of what they're saying, is inspiring people. I want to make sure I vote in this election. So you will get elections that fluctuate on, look, obviously in 2020, the US had a 66.2% voter turnout. Now, what happened in 2020? Well, we know that was Joe Biden against Donald Trump. The election before that, the Democrats were like, Hillary's got this, no worries. They had a low voter turnout. That's one of the things that helped Donald Trump get elected, because all of his supporters were like, we've got to break the system. We've got to make sure we vote. And which was really bad campaigning on the Democrats. But they were like, 100 to 1, Hillary's got this, no worries. The media was talking about it. They were trying to do the momentum game. She's got it. Yeah. Because there is a bit of a human nature thing that a lot of people vote for who they think's going to win, not who they want's going to win, because they want to be in the winning side. Oh, I voted for Labor this time. They're going to win.
Yeah, but that works much better if you're forced to vote. If you have to actually turn up and go, you're not just going to vote for whoever's going to win.
Yeah, that's right. So obviously in 2020, when the Democrats had a huge get out to vote, make sure you vote, make sure you beat Donald Trump. So there are those fluctuations, but it's generally because, for some reason, rightly or wrongly, the voter goes, this is an important election. So it goes back to my point. When there's compulsory voting, it just takes away that importance of the election. That's why most Australians are like, oh, election, God damn, another one, because they don't see it as important, right? Because they just come around every 3 years federally, and then the states and by-elections. And there's some places here in Victoria that have had 3 elections in the last couple of years. Um, so ultimately, yeah, what you get is, I think compulsory voting, which is again probably why the majors love it, is it just makes the sheep go, oh, okay, we'll do the same thing again and not have to care. Where if the sheep didn't have to vote, they wouldn't vote. And I did make this argument in 2010 because at that point, Liberals had a power in both houses, and at that point, I said, it's probably changed now. I said, but what they should have done in that term was get rid of compulsory voting, because they had got rid of compulsory voting. A lot of the people who traditionally voted Labor, who are I don't care about politics, because Labor wasn't quite into the woke realm back then. They were I don't really care about voting. And I said, if Liberals had got rid of compulsory voting, they would have won another 2 terms, because Labor voters would have more at that point were more traditionally less likely to want to vote. So, but then again, they probably looked at the long game and went, yeah, we get rid of it, hurts us later.
So how difficult do you think it would be if there were the willpower of one of the majors, probably the Liberals, to get rid of compulsory voting here?
Well, they would need to get through both the upper and lower house, obviously. So I think
there's nothing constitutional about compulsory voting here in Australia.
No.
So like legally, it's fairly straightforward. It's just a case of politically engineering a way to get that majority in both houses.
Yeah, it's part of the electoral system rather than in the constitution. Yeah. So no, it'd just be a matter of a party with will. Now, again, to the point, will they do that? No, because the major parties are always changing legislation to make it harder for the smaller parties and easier for themselves. I mean, obviously, very recent times, and you've spoken about it on Collectivitis quite a bit, is about the changing of legislation so that Liberal Democrats couldn't use the word liberal. And we took it to court and nearly won it. But in that same legislation, they also introduced that minor parties to be registered had to go from having 500 respondents that are members to 1,500. Now, what we've seen in the last 12 months is a whole lot of small parties being deregistered. So the government is continually changing legislation to try to make sure there's only a couple of parties that have any chance of even being on the ballot paper, let alone have a chance of winning. And to get one of the major parties to say, oh, let's get rid of compulsory voting when it is so much in their favour. So mechanically, not hard. Realistically, almost impossible.
Yeah, I think that there's a kind of a recurring theme that we've talked about a few times here on the show, which is that the most important thing for both Liberal and Labor is never actually the current election and winning the current election. That by far the most important thing for both of them is that it remains with this Liberal or Labor, duopoly. Yeah. Or so, excuse me. You may lose this election. You may lose the next 10, but as long as it's out of Liberal and Labor, you will eventually win. And so keeping that status quo is far more important than any one election or any one contest.
Yeah. And I've heard that point made on your show a bit, but it's even more insidious than that, because I suppose if you're looking at going, oh, it's a binary result. We either win government or we don't win government. It doesn't matter, because even if a party doesn't win government, they're in opposition. They still get all their funding, not election funding, but they get, they are now the shadow. So they still get all their shadow cabinet positions paid for. They still get all their staffers. So the only thing the major parties have to win or lose is, do we get to run government? As far as parties, their party's still there. They still have all the party mechanism. They're all still funded. They're all still got their jobs. They don't have a lot to lose at an election. The only thing is are they running the government or not running the government?
Well, the biggest thing they have to lose is whether a minor party actually gains some traction and starts to win some seats. That's the biggest threat they have to both of them.
And then what they'll do is obviously tried to put Pauline Hanson, or did put Pauline Hanson in jail. They'll do everything. If you start coming out, they'll do everything to basically attack the party, attack the person. Craig Kelly, after the last election, he didn't get elected. UAP got one upper house person elected. But the AEC went after him for the size of his font on his authorisation on his call flutes. So, because obviously Clive Palmer's giving me a head of fun. So as soon as any party tries getting traction, they'll come after you. They don't want to see a minor party rise at all. But there's a lot of conversation because around that time, when Pauline Hanson was coming at Liberals from the right, the Greens were coming at Labor from the left, so people know, like, Greens, they had quite a few senators around the 2010, 2007. Before that, they were still a minor party, only had a few senators. But so both major parties were being attacked. Both major parties said, right, you need to go after the Greens, Labor, and Liberals said, we need to go after Pauline Hanson. And they did. Now, Liberals went hard on Pauline Hanson. Labor kind of wimped out and they went, they attacked the Greens a little bit, but then they went, we'll kind of work with them. And that hasn't worked so well for them because the Greens are dragging everyone further left. So Labor had the chance to probably try and wipe out the Greens, and they probably fumbled the ball on that one. Now the Greens have really captured the hard left field.
And now it's too late, right? Because the Greens are at the point where they will consistently hit 4% minimum, absolutely. So they can continue to run elections with the assurance that they will have funding of some sort, no matter what.
And certainly they're at the point now where they're getting lower house people elected, state-wise, federally, as well as often, if they don't hold balance of power in the upper house, they're very close to it. So, the party in power might be like, well, the only way we're getting it through the upper house, if we haven't got the Greens, is to get every other crossbencher and minor party. Like, it's usually by one vote. They've got to get them all to agree. So the easiest path of getting something through the upper house is with the Greens, because you only got to pick up one or two, maybe other of the crossbenchers. So, and this is again why Liberals are being pulled so far left. It's kind of like, if they want anything done, they've got to deal with the Greens. So, yeah, they've certainly lost that opportunity. Because now, look, if you want to get rid of compulsory voting, you're going to have to convince the Greens as well.
Yeah, and they don't mind having compulsory voting because all the 18-year-olds straight out of school that are forced to vote Greens. Yeah,
and they get 4%, so they get election funding.
Exactly. I think it's really healthy to have these conversations and to bring up these examples, like the font thing with Craig Kelly, because sometimes as just regular people who aren't super involved with campaigning, aren't super involved with elections other than just voting ourselves, we forget quite how just cynical and disgusting it all is. It is just that the people in power are just so cynical about their best interests and improving their situation, and it's got nothing to do with representing the will of the people. People are just a number that you're trying to attain in order to get that majority, in order to get yourself into power. And another aspect of quite how cynical it all is, and I think this was another thing that struck me when I was working in the campaign office, was the way preferences work. Now, and I'm not even talking about group voting tickets, which are a whole other kettle of fish. Kettle of fish, is that the expression? I don't know.
Yeah, it is actually. I don't know where it comes from, but
didn't sound right in my head. But even just regular preferences, like, we assume as voters, I like this party, whatever party it may be, minor, major, upper, lower, whatever. I like this party. I trust them. I'm assuming that whoever they've put number 2 in their preferences is the most aligned party nearest to them, and then number 3, and then number 4, and then number 5. So rarely is that even the case. It's all backroom deals done to try and get some favor over here, so you get some favor over there. And anyone who works in campaigning, like, we knew this, everyone knew it. Everyone knows it's this cynical way of looking at things. The only people who don't know are the people who are trying to engage in the political system to the best of their knowledge in the most honest way, because the most honest people in all of the art of campaigning in terms of what their intentions are and being genuine are the voters who are trying to vote for what they believe in.
Yeah. I think it's probably one of the negatives. Like I agree. The preferential voting system is absolutely the best system. It gives you the opportunity of putting your vote. Eventually, the person that your vote ends in is the one that you most align with. But what it does do is it does encourage the fact of this how to vote. And this is one of the things that the average voter hates about election day. It's running the gauntlet of all the people trying to throw how to vote. And I always sort of say, look, I think, and that, again, this is a very big expense for minor parties, right? So it's often one of the biggest expenses you have is getting your volunteers out there. Major parties will pay people to stand there. Minor parties don't have that option. We've got to try and bring in volunteers and cover booths as best as we can. But just getting printed, you got your lower house, you've got to get a how to vote printed for each lower house area. It's not like you can just go get 1 million how to votes printed. You've got to get a whole lot of 100,000 votes printed. So, or 50,000 votes, how to votes printed for different ones. So the time frames, all that sort of stuff. But to your point is absolutely everyone thinks, oh, the how to vote is what the party thinks. Now, different parties will take different approaches to this. Some parties will just like, I'll put my how to vote, or independents in particular, I'll put my how to vote whatever deal I can do, because they're generally just running. They don't have a party, they don't have a philosophy. Now, where it comes in difficult with something like a Libertarian Party is we stick very much to our principles. So, obviously what we generally will do is like, there's the no ways. There's no way this party is going anywhere near the top. But then there's always that room to negotiate. And, and legitimately, sometimes it's kind of like, even if you're saying between the majors, sometimes it can be like a lot of people tarnish us with saying we're, somehow related to the Liberal Party. Now, I think our principles align more often with the Liberal Party than they do the Labor Party, but, not always. Sometimes, some Labor Party policies aren't that bad. Not as many, but there's some. But sometimes, particularly at a certain election, it might be, or a specific electorate where the candidate is quite a good candidate. It might be, that party is better. So, we've got room to move on that area. So we might negotiate who's going to give us the best deal. And it's quite insidious that we are basically saying, you give us a good deal on where you put us on your how to vote, we'll give you a better deal on ours. And the average voter doesn't know that, but it's absolutely a necessity in elections, particularly for a minor party, to deal with other minor parties. So, yes, we'll do deals with a major party. That might be the case that, if Liberals put us high, then at least their voters go, well, the Libertarians can't be too bad because they're high on Liberal parties how to vote. And if we also get high on Labor Party, everyone's like, well, both Labor and Liberal think these Libertarians aren't too bad. So, we get better, I suppose, reputational. But where it obviously is a big benefit for a minor party is your deals with other minor parties. Because what you're trying to do is stay in the race. So if we do a deal with, say, two minor parties, Party X, Party Y, right? If we can be ahead of Party X and Party Y before they get knocked out, when they get knocked out, if people followed their how to votes and we were high on theirs, we get it. And so we get their votes, we stay in. And the aim is for a minor party. So Nick Xenophon got some people elected in the lower house. He got a couple of people elected. But basically what happens is you're trying to be number 2 when there's 3 parties left. So if we can be in a position where we might only got 15% primary vote, but we've picked up a lot of preferences and we've been leapfrogging. If it can be, let's say, Labor, us, and then Liberals. And this often is potential in electorates where something like Liberals are incredibly on the nose or something like that. If we can stay at number 2, when Liberal gets locked out, Liberal voters aren't going to send their preferences to Labor. We can get those, we leapfrog Labor, and you get in. So you can get elected on 15% primary. Now, this is where the big parties go, oh, how did that person get elected on 15% primary? Preferential works because you are the most liked,
Hmm.
right? So as much as the big parties will complain, particularly in upper house ones where how did someone get elected on 1.5% of the vote? It's because everyone else thought you were shit and they were all right. They just didn't get the first vote. So look, if everyone voted on how they liked it, that'd be great. But that's not, most voters are fairly uneducated when they go in about this. We've already, the big parties don't want you to be educated on it. But how to vote is just a recommendation. It is your vote when you go into the polling booth to vote however you want. So I suppose the counter argument to that is this is just the parties recommending what to do because it's in their best interest. So if you do what we say, it helps us the most. Unfortunately, people think that's how you rank the parties. Now, the how to vote is how it helps us the most. But the answer is go in. If you think we are great, vote for us. If you think Greens are second best to us, you can put Greens at number 2. You might say that would be weird, but when you actually look at how some of the preferences flow, there are some strange preference flows when you look at people who are voting for number 1 for a party and you're like, oh, and they voted number 2 for that. That's a strange combination. But it means that you're probably making an argument to their voter base that resonates.
Yeah, I mean that does happen. I've sort of seen it, but
not often.
That is quite rare as well. It's weird to think that like it's just this kind of sick game that certain people within certain parties are playing. It's like a weird board game that they're all playing, trying to manipulate each other and outmaneuver each other, and there's all these various facets of it. And I think we did an episode a few weeks ago talking about democracy and everything wrong with democracy, just in general as a concept, not even talking about this. But even in the most positive view of democracy, like it's the people having their say on who's in power. Even if you're looking at democracy through this lens and giving it, as we said before, some sort of legitimacy, that kind of breaks down when you find out actually how it works as well. Because really, it's not. It's how best can these people who work within these parties manipulate each other and play this game and manipulate voters in order to win their little their goal. And obviously different parties of different sizes have different goals. But I think all of that is undermines democracy, even if you have this rose-tinted view of how it works.
Well, I think it very much goes to one of my first points. That's where I think minor parties are the foundation of democracy. Because yes, look, we're trying to get power, we're trying to get elected, but often we're just trying to convey our opinion, our policy. We know we're not going to get elected. We don't run in elections at lower house going, oh, we're going to win this seat. We know we aren't going to win. What we want to try to do is get our message across. But ultimately, absolutely, the major parties, as much as people think, what they just want is their power. They want to maintain their power and get more power. It's quite funny because when I first, got together with my partner, who's completely apolitical, and she was like,
as is often the case for libertarians, their partner is often apolitical, and they have to be to maintain some balance in the household.
Absolutely. But she was like, but isn't the government there just to help us? Now, aren't politicians getting elected because they want? I'm like, no. And the more, as time's gone on, she's become very cynical. And when I start throwing things at the telly, at the news and all that, she's now like, oh, gets angry as well, where she just thought, oh, no. But the average person does think that these parties are out trying to help them. Now, what they're doing is they're presenting policies that they think is going to win them votes, right? And sometimes those policies they even know aren't going to be good for the nation, but they know it's going to be popular. But there is a balance. I'm not saying they're just out there patting their Persian cat trying to take over the world, although some might. But ultimately, the major parties are after power. So it is a bit like, oh, everyone's trying to manipulate a system to get power, and that argument could be made. But the minor parties are not doing it because they think they're ever going to get elected. So the most democratic, like I said before at the start, the minor parties is where democracy is, presenting different ideas, presenting alternative views, giving a way for change to make things better. But the minor parties, because major parties just want to push that down. They don't want you. They want to keep everyone in that cloud, the fog of war, because to them it's just about maintaining the power between the two. So I think yes, minor parties do it because we have to There was an argument, and you mentioned group voting tickets before, where people said, "Oh, just don't be involved in it." It's like, but that's the system we are working in. You can't go, "Look, I hate the system. I aren't going to use that system," because you'll never get anywhere. So it's a really horrible thing as a libertarian going, "I hate compulsory voting. I hate election funding, but I have to try to manipulate the system that it best helps us." If we got elected, great, we'd get rid of it. But we're working in a system that we fundamentally disagree with. But if we don't do it, then we've got no hope of ever changing it.
Well, I mean, I'm an anarcho-capitalist, right? I don't believe that. I think the world would be more prosperous and more honest and more fair if there were no government. And yet I'm involved in the party. Politics. So, I mean, I'm obviously considering that to get some small incremental change, I have to sacrifice some part of my philosophy, because otherwise nothing will happen and nothing will change. And lo and behold, the government's going to continue getting bigger. So, I mean, it's a criticism that's often made of libertarians that, a libertarian party is an oxymoron. But in actual fact, the alternative is to just allow the state and the status quo to continue. So we have to engage in these, voting tickets and whatever else.
And in a country where there's compulsory voting, you can't just opt to not care because you're being forced to go and vote. So, at least if you're like, if you could say, "Look, I'm just going to tune out. I'm going to go live in my hut out in the bush. I'm not going to pay tax. I'm not going to do that." There isn't that option. We've got your podcast is called Collectivitis. There are so many rules and regulations that say you have to be involved in society. You have to vote. You have to pay tax. You have to do all these things. And if you don't, we're going to come after you and give you a criminal conviction.
We are almost at the hour mark, or just past it. Before we go, I did want to hear, so we've talked lots about things that are unjust, things that are wrong. Are there any other ways, just while we're at it, that the major parties exploit the system that they've created in order to maintain power or suppress minor parties? Are there any other big ones that spring to mind?
Well, there's numerous ways the party will manipulate legislation that it helps them, but probably more insidious is the way they manipulate the media.
Okay.
Obviously they have so much sway over the media. There's obviously here in Victoria, just one point, Victorian fine for not voting is $96, not $20. So
wow, yeah.
So funny that Victoria, the most socialist state, has one of the highest fines. But so obviously there's a lot of discussion in Victoria when Dan Andrews was premier that he had the media on the string. The media. If the media asked him a question he didn't like, that journalist would lose their media privileges and so forth like that. How do they do that? Well, they have government advertising. They spend huge amounts of money with the major parties, with the major media outlets. And so the major media outlets don't want to upset the party in power. So again, even from the opposition, it's hard because the party in power has so much, election funding. Why do we get ads on TV that just say, "Oh, this department is doing this marvelous thing," and everyone's like, "Yeah, we know that." Well, that's a multi-million-dollar advertising campaign that they're paying the media for. So the media has no incentive to bolster up the minor parties. Now, we had an example. We've got a by-election here in Dunkley in Victoria. A couple of weeks ago was when all the final nominations happened, and so I was in another room and I heard it come on the TV. Today marks the start of the official campaign for Dunkley. So I raced into the lounge room to watch what the news report was. And so there was obviously 8 candidates nominated. There was Labor, Liberal, Greens, ourselves, a couple of other minor parties, and 1 independent. And I'm like, "Oh, they're going to actually report on the Dunkley by-election. This would be great." And they said, and they went straight to Albo, had a press conference down there, speaking about some stuff. They went to Peter Dutton, and then that was the article. So that was the news article, was a by-election is happening. This was the day that all the candidates all final nominations went in. The AEC published who all the candidates were, the parties, everything. The media just spoke, "Oh, Labor, this is the Labor and this is the Liberal candidate." So not like even if they didn't interview our candidate, I don't get they're going to give 8 candidates an interview, but they didn't even mention that there was 8 candidates running, right? They didn't mention that, obviously 5 of them were from other parties. They just mentioned Labor and Liberal. So that's, between the major parties manipulating the electoral system and just holding the major media basically by, I know you can swear on the shows, I got them by the balls. Then what chance, when the average non-interested or unengaged voter who's watching the news that night doesn't even get told there's other candidates running, they just get told about the Labor and Liberal candidate. How does a minor party get any recognition of our candidate, let alone what our policies are?
Yeah. It's like the lies by omission, essentially, is what they constantly do. This constant, hey, they not mentioning us, not talking about us, and what all that we're trying to achieve really by trying to bolster our name is this sense of legitimacy that we exist so that we can push the ideas and potentially get more people to vote for us. Because
to that point, if the media is not talking about you, giving you, at least equal, sort of coverage, the major parties are making sure you can't get money, because the only other way, if you're not getting media, is to buy advertising and spend money. So you're running a campaign on the smell of an oily rag.
Yeah.
And then you get people going, well, if you want to get more votes, you need to make sure people know who you are. It's like, that would be fantastic. That would be great. If a way that we can let everyone know who we are and what our policies are for no money, please tell me, because I haven't come up with one yet. Social media has been a bit good, but social media has, in a way, conversely doesn't, because you're often talking to your own echo chamber of people who already support you.
And there's room in social media for paid ads where the big spenders can out noise the smaller ones. All right. Well, I mean, there's loads that we could talk about. We should wrap it up here because we are already over time. Thank you so much for your time, Rick. Is there anything that you'd like to leave our listeners with? Any last message? Anything?
Well, I suppose we've already spoken about it. Support minor parties. I'm not saying everyone watching is going to be a libertarian supporter, but obviously I would like you to support us. But if not, support a minor party. If you can donate, but certainly, what Pietro said before, when you go and vote, put them number one. If they happen to get 4%, they'll at least get some money back of what they spent. And you don't profiteer from it. You just get money back that you've already spent. So at least let us get some money back, but it will send a message to the major parties and more people. Now, it's important to know that over the last 20 years, the major parties' votes are always dropping. And this is why they keep changing legislation. They change legislation to try to go, we'll turn this around. But it's like, if you were better, you would stop losing votes. So they are afraid of the minor parties. So if you can somehow support a minor party with your vote, with donations, with helping them out on volunteering around election time, then, even if it doesn't help them get elected, it's certainly going to push that message to the major parties that you need to start listening to what they have to say.
Brilliant. So now's the time to get involved. Now's the time to break the system up, break that duopoly up. If you don't already, you can follow us on Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, Spotify. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you again for your time, Rick. We will catch
you, everybody.
You later.